All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Greetings. My name is Ted Jackson. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm your moderator for today's LGBTQ Victory Fund live panel, celebrating disability pride, queer, disabled, and electable. As someone who identifies as gay and disabled, an advocate, LGBTQ campaign operative, and Democratic Party political staff, I am thrilled to be a part of today's important discussion about the intersections between these two communities and our efforts to grow the capacity of our electoral power. Disability Pride Month, which as you all know is July, began really as a disability pride parade in Boston, Massachusetts to celebrate the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. Since then, it's grown throughout the nation with notable disability pride festivals in New York City, Chicago, Illinois, and San Jose, California, among many other locations. Every year in July, people with disabilities and their allies celebrate the anniversary of the ADA signing and use this opportunity as a call to action to become more engaged through events like the National Council on Independent Living's annual conference and Rev Up's National Disability Voter Registration Week, which is supported by the American Association of People with Disabilities. So we're really glad to have you here with us today. Don't forget that if a question pops into your mind, please put it in the comment or chat box, because we will have time later on to have our panelists answer those questions. So we've got a great panel of folks with us today. Jess Benham is running for Pennsylvania State House District 36, yay, and won the Democratic primary in June. If elected, Jess will be the first openly LGBTQ woman elected to the Pennsylvania State Legislature and one of the first out autistic state legislators in the country. We also have with us Reggie Greer, who is the former Director of Constituency Engagement for LGBTQ Victory Institute, where he worked to build and support its network of 800 plus LGBTQ elected officials nationwide. Wow, that's huge. He's now the LGBTQ Vote Director for Joe Biden for President. And we have with us Maria Towne, who is the President and CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities, which works to increase the political and economic power of people with disabilities. Previously, she led the Houston Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities and managed disability engagement in the Obama White House as a senior associate director in the Office of Public Engagement. So welcome all. And now I'm going to give each of our panelists a chance to introduce themselves and tell us about what disability pride means to them, including the similarities and or differences with LGBTQ pride. Please also begin by telling us your pronouns. So let's start with Jess.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Ted, for that lovely introduction, and of course to Victory Fund for having us all today. I'm Jessica Benham. My pronouns are she, her. I am a white cis woman with brown hair, and I'm wearing this green dress and a necklace. And for me, I'm running for state representative in Pennsylvania, as Ted noted, and I'm running on a platform that really emphasizes the ways in which my lived experience and the lived experiences with people in my district are similar. The ways that we are struggling to maintain healthcare coverage, the ways in which COVID-19 has impacted our income and our participation in the economy, the ways in which climate change has impacted our district. Now, all of these things and issues, because I'm a person with a disability, impact me in ways that are disproportionate than they are for other people. And so I've had a lot of conversations with people in my district about my lived experience and the ways in which it means I'll advocate more strongly for them. But talking about disability pride, disability pride has been a part of my campaign, and I haven't always called it that. But I talk about campaigning openly as a disabled person. And And we've never hidden my disability on the campaign trail. Sometimes I walk with a cane, sometimes I don't. And we've openly talked about me being autistic. And a lot of people have found that to be reflective of their own lives. You know, many voters have disabilities themselves or have family members with disabilities. And, you know, I've received comments from people, you know, one of my mailers had, you know, me on it using a cane and a friend of mine who uses a wheelchair. And I got comments from people saying, you know, I never thought I'd see an elected official have visibly disabled people on their mail, let alone be a person with a disability themselves. And so for me, you know, disability is a huge part of the human experience. And I am proud of the ways in which you know, I've fought to make disability rights available more broadly and to more groups of people. I am proud of who I am and who I've become and how I'm fighting for my district. In much the same way, though also different, as I'll get to, you know, being a bisexual person is a part of who I am. And it's something that I have talked about and been open about on the campaign trail. But the discrimination that I face as a bi person, the systemic inequality that I face as a bi person is different than what I face as a disabled person. I can see the ways in which you know, systems of inequity impact me differently by virtue of being bi versus, you know, having a disability. And I watch abled LGBTQ people be treated differently than I am, and I watch you know, straight, cis, disabled people be treated differently than I am. So there's certainly you know, different things going on when it comes to the way systems of oppression impact me. So I think about all of those things when I'm thinking about disability pride versus LGBTQ pride.
That's great. Reggie.
Thank you so much, Ted, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Reggie Greer, and I am the LGBTQ plus vote director for Joe Biden. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm just really happy to be here today to not only celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, but just to have this conversation, because having a conversation around pride really is recognizing and owning your own power, and you know, whether that be your individual power and your individual voice and narrative, or the collective power of the community that you belong to. And I'm a proud member of both the LGBTQ community and you know, someone that's proud of my disability. To answer your question, Ted, I think I always like to start off with a story. So I was born with hemifacial microsomia, which is in the same family as cleft lip and palate. And I had 18 surgeries before my 16th birthday on a myriad of issues. But my mom would always tell me, you know, anytime I did anything good in life, she would say, well, you remember the doctor always told me whenever I took you home from the hospital that you know, just let him live out his days in peace. He won't really amount to much in life. So you know, you think about how far we've come in just raising awareness of like how our potential as human beings aren't diminished because of our disabilities. I would like to say that they have been enhanced because they've taught me how to see people for who they are. Jessica made the perfect point. Our lived experiences allow us to not only be proud of ourselves or proud of our community, but also relate to people in so many different ways. So, you know, this Pride Month, LGBTQ Pride Month, was so different because, you know, people had to really had to forego the parades and the festivals and then think about why Pride started in the first place, which was a protest against systemic injustice and a protest against police brutality. And in having those conversations this Pride, I think we were able to remember the shoulders and the giants that we stand upon, and think about the ways in which inequity still impact the lives of LGBTQ people. The same thing exists for people with disabilities. We have so far to go the ADA did so much to improve the lives of people living with disabilities in the United States. But we still know that there are institutions and systems that still negatively impact the trajectory and the well-being of people with disabilities. And so pride to me really does mean that we ought to remember the power of our own voices, lean in on that, and try to make change for not only ourselves, but our communities.
Wow, that's powerful, and that's a lot. Maria, great to see you.
Hello, great to see you too, Ted, and thank you to the Victory Fund for having me. I feel so honored and privileged to just be in this virtual space with folks that I respect so much. So my name is Maria Towne, and as Ted mentioned, I serve as the president and CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a white cis woman with long brown hair. I'm wearing a black and white jacket, earrings, and red lipstick. You know, when I think about disability pride, the first step for me is a recognition that disability is an identity. I think many people, the dominant understanding of disability is as a condition or a diagnosis. And those conditions and diagnoses are real, and they are necessary for a number of things like access to healthcare. But more than that label, disability is an identity. The second kind of step in a disability pride journey for me is recognizing that that identity informs who you are as a person and gives you a valuable perspective on the world. Now, I want to be clear, when I talk about disability pride, I don't think that somebody has to love every aspect of their experience with disability. I have cerebral palsy, and it affects my body and my mind in a variety of ways. And I will tell you, sometimes I want to curse at my own feet because they refuse to do what I need them to do. I get frustrated with myself and my surroundings because sometimes I wake up in pain. One of my favorite poets, who is a queer disabled person, Laura Hershey, one of our elders, she wrote a poem called "You Get Proud by Practicing." And when we start talking about similarities between disability pride and LGBT pride, one thing that we share and have to navigate on a daily basis is microaggressions, right? And are all of these little things that can chip away at our dignity. And as a disabled queer woman, anytime something like that happens to me and I have to recenter myself and all my identities, I think about that as an opportunity to practice my pride. Anytime I'm frustrated, it is an opportunity to get proud by practicing. Talking about other similarities between LGBT pride and disability pride, our communities have a shared history of medicalization and cure. You know, the LGBT community, one of its first big victories was getting homosexuality out of the DSM, and we are still fighting against conversion therapy of LGBT people and LGBT youth. Well, in the disability community, and I know Jess probably can talk at length about this, talk to autistic people about ABA. Talk to kids like me with mobility impairments who were forced to spend decades of our lives learning how to walk and making our bodies do things that they're not meant to do. Building off of something Reggie said, when I think about disability pride and LGBT pride and our similarities, you know, today's conversation is really about recognizing the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it's a complicated anniversary this year because of COVID and because of what's happening around police violence. We have seen how fragile our civil rights really are. And it can also be difficult to celebrate this law, a product of our state, when our nation is not being as responsive as it needs to be to all of our communities who are hurting right now. And so when we celebrate the ADA, what we need to focus on celebrating are all of those advocates who fought for decades to make it possible, and all of the advocates who've continued to fight for decades and on a daily basis to make the goals of the ADA a reality. Just like in LGBT Pride, when we celebrate the protests led by Marsha P. Johnson and others, when we celebrate the ADA and Disability Pride, we are celebrating ourselves. Whether we are raging, whether we are having a reckoning, or whether we are like able to one day sit happily at brunch, it is a celebration of ourselves and our community, and nobody can take that pride away from us, even if they try to take away our rights.
Wow, that, Maria, I wrote down some notes. I'm going to steal some phrases. Get proud by practicing. That's amazing. And I'm glad that you talked about the anniversary of the ADA, because that's where we're going to kick off with our first question. And then we're going to dig deeper into some questions around policy and running for office. So this first one actually goes out to everyone. And I want to go to Jessica first with this, and then have both Maria and Reggie answer it. But with this month being the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, let's think about its legacy and how it has improved access for people with disabilities, and how changes in society, though, also leave us wanting and needing for more. And so for each of you, what is the best parts of the ADA, and what is it missing that informs the next stage of advocacy?
Yeah, so I was born the year the ADA was passed. So I am approximately six months younger than it. I turned 30 later this year. And so I am definitely part of that ADA generation. I did not know a time when I did not have its protections. And I'll sometimes compare it to this blanket that my great-grandmother knitted me when I was born. And it's a beautiful blanket, but it's also very small. It only covers my feet, and it's got this spot that is burned on it because I tried to use it to construct a blanket fort, and I used a lamp as one of the the poles. And much like my blanket, the ADA, I love it, and it's very useful. It's without its protections, I would not be where I am today. And yet, also like my blanket, it when you grow up, leaves some things wanting. And so 30 years down the road, we have a long way to go. And, the ADA is not disability justice. Having to sue for our civil rights is not disability justice. Now, there are a lot of things that are disability justice. Fighting to ensure that our people can receive the services that they need to live a good life in their homes and in our communities, that's part of disability justice. Fighting to get people out of jails and prisons, that is disability justice. Struggling to create access when people have conflicting access needs is disability justice. And so we have a long way to go. And when I think about legislation and policy, which I'm sure we'll get into later, there are a lot of different bills that we could pass that would move us closer to justice for our people. But when I think about the ADA, I still think about the many ways in which my life and the trajectory that I am, I wouldn't be running for office if it weren't for the ADA. So I have a lot to thank for it.
Reggie.
Yeah, I think about my own journey. Jessica, I'm a little older. I was born in 1987, but by the time I got ready to go to school in the early 90s, the ADA had completely revolutionized how the education system treated kids with disabilities. Even the healthcare system, the kinds of accommodations that were needed for the particular types of disabilities that people were approaching the system with. And for me, I think my parents were wanting to do the best for me to ensure that I got a quality education. Here, having hemifacial microsomia ensured that I'm deaf in one ear. And so, thinking about the kinds of accommodations that I needed to ensure that I could hear my teachers, be fully participatory in the activities at school, but also have for my parents and the insurance and the healthcare coverage to be able to have some of the early surgeries that I needed, and to have the complexity of the surgeries that I needed to really sort of help me move along in life. So I think about that all the time, because I think about what life could have been like for me if the ADA hadn't existed, and my parents, a railroad engineer and a registered nurse, having to navigate that landscape for their child without a law like the ADA in place. But what I think about now, and it makes me so proud to be on the campaign that I'm on, is that to Jessica's point, people with disabilities need an integrated system, and they need people talking to each other to ensure that from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to sleep at night, that everything in their lives is made better, and that not only do they have access to the types of services that they need or the healthcare that they need, but they are able to approach some of the disparities in a way that allows them to actually see it through, and to actually get justice, and to actually improve their lives and the trajectory of their lives. So in thinking about, I had the pleasure of sitting with the Vice President Joe Biden when he unveiled his disability plan, in early June, and throughout that whole plan, there was a careful attention to not only the impact that COVID-19 is having on people with disabilities, but just the holistic nature in which to approach the lives of people who have disabilities, and to put out a plan that ensures that people have access to high quality health care, that they can get long-term care if they need it, and thinking about the kinds of protections that care providers need to care for people with disabilities, and so forth and so on. And it made me really sort of proud that we were, again, thinking about the holistic nature of people's lives, and not just piecemealing solutions together to try to marginally improve people's lives, but actually looking at the issues that people with disabilities are facing.
Maria?
So first, I just want to thank Jess and Reggie for sharing their stories and those powerful remarks. To take a slightly different tact, I think that some of the best parts of the ADA are all of the things that 30 years later we take for granted. Curb cuts, captioning during football games when you're in a crowded bar, elevators in buildings that are 50 stories high. All of that is because of the ADA. The fact that disabled children can play on playgrounds, that grandparents who may be raising their grandchildren can play on playgrounds with those children. Because a lot of these things happen seamlessly today, we don't think that, 35 years ago, advocates were taking sledgehammers to curbs to create their homemade curb cuts. And now people with luggage, folks with strollers, people with groceries are all using those curb cuts. And I just think, I think about those aspects of our lives, and that's what civil rights should look like. It shouldn't be a fight. Having rights, having inclusion, having justice, to me, is actually about being able to rest. Knowing that I can be my full self in a space and not have to worry about whether my access needs will be met, about whether or not I will be taking up too much space because people will perceive me as a burden. It means I can just relax and rest and be. And the ADA has created a lot of opportunities for that. At the same time, there is a lot to be desired. And I'm so glad that Jess said that the ADA is not disability justice, because it is not. And I want to be clear, the ADA doesn't operate in a vacuum. it relies actually on a number of other laws and programs to make its goals real. So one of the primary goals of the ADA is community integration. Our nation still has what's called an institutional bias. It is often an easier choice for someone to go into a nursing home than to remain in their home and in their community to receive the supports that they need to thrive. And we need to change that whole system. We need to understand that it is a violation of the ADA when someone cannot get their personal care needs met at home. In addition to Medicaid, right, we have the Fair Housing Act, we have the Social Security system, all of which have slightly different definitions and understandings of disability. And so you see these mismatches of policy constantly, and that means people with disabilities fall through the cracks. One of the other most amazing things about the Americans with Disabilities Act is that, disabled people were able to imagine a world better than the one that they experienced in order to get it passed. And I think for me, one of the just greatest joys of my life has been meeting other people with disabilities, living in their communities, working their dream jobs, and having too few, but having some role models so that I could understand what kind of life was possible for me. And my hope for the next 30 years is that, the youth today, people who are participating in AAPD's internship program, grow up to lead lives that I could never even imagine because disability justice is accessible to them.
Thank you. And we're going to bounce off of that. And now we're going to get into, really how you navigate running for office, but navigate political spaces, which I think is so much of the conversation around accessibility and about integration. As someone who works in providing accessibility in, big political structures, I can tell you it's a part of my life every day. And I live everything that the three of you have said on that question every day through this wonderful, amazing document, the ADA, that also has some nebulous parts and parts where you kind of feel like you're being Secretary of State and bringing things together to get an accommodation to happen. So this first question is this next round, I'm going to do individual questions for folks. And this first one, I'm going to ask Jess, because you are running for office right now. So, representation in elected office for people with disabilities, and specifically LGBTQ people with disabilities, has a lot of room to grow. So what are the barriers to access for getting elected to office for disabled and LGBTQ folks, and how do we break those barriers?
Oh, that is quite the question, and I will attempt to do it justice without talking for a really long time. There are a lot of different barriers to getting involved in political life, for starters, and then to running for office. And some of them are simple and like really practical things. Pittsburgh is an old city, and I'm not sure I've ever been to a big political fundraiser that's been in a fully accessible space. So, political fundraisers are the life of the campaign season. It's where you meet people and network. And, if the space itself isn't accessible, not to mention that you are donating to people's campaigns to get into these places. So if you're not a well-off person, which many people with disabilities are not, then that's an even bigger barrier. Now, I was lucky to be somebody who a lot of local electeds kind of took under their wing. And so I was able to attend these events for free and, mingle with people and meet people that way. But I was often compromising my own health to do so. I was saying, all right, well, at the end of today, I got to make it up. I know at least a flight of stairs one time, got to save some energy, got to, and those are the choices and the sacrifices that you have to make. And, many times I would get to the end of the day and know that I had made unhealthy choices for myself, even though I knew that these were choices I had to make to fight for the people in my district. I also recognize there's some privilege in that even being a choice, right? So as an autistic person, I cannot tell you the amount of times people have told me that they would never guess or would never know that I was autistic. And, some of that is that autism tends to look different in women. And so it's not what people expect. But some of that is also about the fact that I have almost a PhD in communication. And when you study the thing that you were bad at as an autistic person growing up, you start to get pretty good at it. And there is some educational privilege there and some passing privilege there in terms of being able to appear not autistic, which is also exhausting. And so thinking about those burdens, those choices that I make throughout the campaign trail and the ways that those impact me influenced how I run my own campaign. I will tell my campaign staff often that this is a CRIP space. This is a space where we accept that productivity is not tied to our self-worth, that we do not have to force our bodies or our minds to do things that they're not able to do in this moment, that we're able to treat time differently and treat space differently. And in some ways, COVID has made campaigning more accessible. You're talking about virtual fundraisers and phone calls instead of door knocking. That changes accessibility and made campaigning more accessible for me. But it's made campaigning less accessible for other people, right? I don't think I've been to a virtual fundraiser that has had captions or interpreters. I don't think that I have. How would you campaign in COVID if you're a person who doesn't speak on the phone? I don't know. So there are definitely ways in which COVID has made campaigning less accessible. But I've chosen to host all of my fundraisers in accessible locations. I've chosen to provide a variety of different ways to engage with the campaign, to participate, to volunteer, pay a living wage to my staff, all of those things that are choices that I can make as a candidate to make my campaign at least more accessible for some people. And it's, I think, made an impact, at least in terms of people thinking about it. I had an ASL interpreter at my campaign launch, and a number of local elected officials had never even thought about hiring an interpreter for their campaign events. And I don't know that they will, but at least they're thinking about it now, and that's something. So I like to think I'm making a little bit of a difference there, but it's not easy. My potential future colleagues in Harrisburg, there are some who have said the quiet part out loud as it is, that COVID-19 isn't a big deal because it's only killing people with pre-existing conditions, people like me. So to know that some of my potential future colleagues don't think that my life matters, that my life is worth something, that is demoralizing when it comes to campaigning. That's also something that keeps people with disabilities out of campaign spaces. So that's my attempt to answer that question without going on at length. I could probably talk for 3 hours on it.
And just like the others, I took some notes and you've given me some great quotes. So I think I'll be quoting a lot on Twitter later. I'm going to go to Maria next and then Reggie afterwards. And, Maria, we're talking about candidates with Jess and the candidate experience. And every candidate, especially if you're a candidate that identifies very proudly and loudly with your particular community, you want to build up a base of voters from your community. And certainly voters navigate the political and electoral space in this, just as candidates do. So I know that AAPD has the Rev Up Coalition. You do National Disability Voter Registration Week. And so I want to kind of ask about what is the experience of navigating the election system or the political system for voters with disabilities? What are the barriers and how do we break those barriers?
Well, where do we start? I do want to acknowledge some progress. This year in the presidential campaign cycle, we saw something that we had never seen before, which is that every Democratic candidate for president released a disability policy platform, every single candidate. And I have never seen a candidate introduce a disability policy platform before the nomination. And so it was incredible to see so much engagement with our community. While the primaries were happening, it really felt like we had broken one layer of the glass ceiling, at least this time around, because historically, candidates have not put significant resources into engaging with the disability community. And there are many reasons for that. One, as just mentioned, poverty is extremely high in the disability community. Disability is both a cause and consequence of poverty. And so, most of us are not going to be maxing out for particular candidates, even if it's candidates that we believe in. I also think that the nature of how you contribute to campaigns is often very ableist and it excludes many people with disabilities who may experience barriers to transportation. They may not be able to get out there and door knock. And so, we're not seen as this vital part of the campaign, and therefore candidates don't do proactive outreach to our organizations. At the same time, the disability vote is one of the largest voting blocks in the United States. We are 35 million strong. In the 2018 election, the disability vote grew by 8.5%, which is amazing. And so, I want anyone associated with campaigns, whether you're a candidate, a finance director, a campaign manager, to hear me when I say engage the disability community, because all issues are disability issues, all policy is disability policy, and you want to hear what we think. I'll note that the disability community historically has been bipartisan, which I think also contributes to the ways that candidates engage, and how in many ways it's a blessing that no party wants to take ownership of us, but that means we get less engagement from both sides, and so that's tricky to navigate. There are also barriers to the polls, right, that limit our civic engagement. And whether it's an inaccessible polling place, a accessible voting machine that actually, is not turned on or no one knows how to use, or poll workers who decide that this person is too significantly disabled to vote, it just diminishes our overall, it erases us in the political conversation. There are other forms of voter suppression that so many marginalized communities have worked to confront, and they impact people with disabilities as well. I have been turned away from the polls 3 different times because I didn't have a driver's license. I don't drive because of the nature of my disability. How often do we see that happening? And the polling place happened to be in the office building where I worked, so like I had almost 0 barriers, and yet when I showed up, they said, you're not going to be able to cast a ballot because you don't have the right kind of ID. I also want to encourage any political group to begin to understand that people with disabilities are amongst your ranks. So if a candidate is reaching out to the LGBT community, let's make sure we have an event that isn't centered around alcohol, because substance abuse in treatment is a disability. Any campaign event, even if it's not explicitly focused on the disability community, needs to be accessible. And I think when we can create spaces where people who already strongly identify with one particular identity can begin to see themselves in another, whether that's an LGBT identity or a disability identity, that is progress.
Yeah, and there's you know, it's really interesting because there's so much more to do in the political field with accessibility, and yet I do think that when we look around, we've taken a big you know movement forward when it comes to inclusion, and we can at least track progress, and that's going to lead me to Reggie, because I'm going to Reggie's got the next question. And what's really interesting, I think, is that we actually, in addition, Maria, we saw some of the campaigns actually hire disability roles, which we've never seen before. You know, pre-convention.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, full disclosure, last time it was me. It was just me. You know, and then before me it was Becky Ogle, just Becky Ogle. And so we saw multiple campaigns with this. And Reggie, you work for a campaign, and what's interesting is you are an LGBTQ disabled person working in an LGBTQ role. So now it's not just that, you know, I know that there's a disability person, Molly, on your campaign, but you're a person with a disability in a role that's not, you know, specifically disability related. So that's kind of, you know, exciting to see. So I'm interested, Reggie, from your perspective, and you can answer this from either way. How are LGBTQ people with disabilities affected differently than cisgender straight people with disabilities in the political space?
Oh my goodness. You said earlier, Ted, that you live the ADA every day. And you know, I think about this question in a myriad of ways every day. The ways in which LGBTQ people with disabilities and, you know, cis people or, you know, folks who don't have disabilities or others in our community, you know, range, right? And Jessica sort of hit the nail on the head earlier. Sometimes, you know, people don't know, you know, what your disability might be, so then they treat you a different way. But I think for me, they come in, you know, they come in a lot of different ways. Insults, perhaps ways people think about your cognitive abilities, the ways in which the responsibilities that people give you. But I'm proud to be on a campaign in which they're looking around the country and they're saying, there are a lot of people who can bring their best selves and their whole selves to these roles, to policy roles, to analytical roles, to research roles, to outreach roles. And they don't have to be squarely doing that kind of outreach or have those kinds of responsibilities in a particular community. And, you know, again, it makes me honored to sort of be in the role that I'm in, but then also I'm able to bring other experiences into at least this campaign to talk about why it's important to have an intersectional and holistic approach to everything that we do as a campaign. And, you know, I have to give hats off to not only the vice president, but the people around him and people who make up the Biden campaign, because what I've seen is that instead of me having to go to people and say, hey, we need to do more on, we need to make sure that these virtual events are accessible as we enter this, or we continue down this virtual campaign trail, or that we need to include people who bring a lens from the disability community into this conversation, because you know, this is an important policy that's being formed, or that we're doing outreach to another community. It'd be great to have you know, someone with a disability in that conversation. They're already doing that, and they're coming to me and saying, hey, who do you know? Who else can we talk to? We've talked to this list of people, and do you know anyone else? And I think when your spaces are collaborative, because they're inclusive, it makes your work so much more enjoyable. It makes your passion all the more you know, all the more revved up, and it makes the solutions and the outcome all that much better.
And I just want to shout out Reggie really quickly, because he, you know, in his role that's focused on LGBT outreach, he has consistently reached out to the disability community and said, you know, does this graphic accurately reflect how wheelchairs operate and what they look like? Do you know any BIPOC, LGBT disabled people that we can include in this event. Like he really walks the walk and talks the talk, and I just want to have a Reggie Greer appreciation moment right now.
Well, can I have a Maria Towne appreciation moment back? We both served together in the Obama-Biden administration, and Jessica was answering the question earlier about why few people with disabilities run for office, and talking about not having role models to look up to and to see. And to be inspired by, to actually take the plunge and to run. Seeing Maria take over, well, first of all, do the work of leading our community while President Obama and Vice President Biden were in office was tremendous, and just a joy to watch her carry us for as long as she was in that role. But when she took over the White House Instagram and social media accounts and told her story, elevating someone who has such an important role in the Obama-Biden White House, and speaking for the president and the vice president in that moment and telling her story, for me, working as an appointee at the U.S. Department of Transportation, I remember sitting down at my desk and having a moment, where I got teary-eyed because, that kind of representation is invaluable. Seeing someone in those roles, encourages others to say, hey, I want to seek an appointment for a president that I believe in, or I might want to run for office to be the next Jessica Benham in Pennsylvania, right? I might want to take the lead and actually, use all of my gifts in all the ways in which I know I can serve people by entering electoral politics. And that's just so important. So when people are thinking about what's next for them, if they are also LGBTQ and they have a disability and they're thinking about how to get into this space, I just would encourage everyone to remember that in this moment, the next fight around what happens with the ADA and any sort of disability justice needs your voice. If you're not at that table, then someone else who doesn't have your lived experience is going to end up making those decisions on behalf of you and on behalf of the 35 million voters out there that Maria talked about, and so many others who are living with a disability. As my grandmother always says, don't let anyone ever speak for you. So speak for yourself and go out and fight for us.
So we're right near the end of our time. So I'm going to wrap us out with one final question for each of you, and this is kind of a speed round. So I'm going to ask folks to keep it short. We're going to go Maria, Reggie, and then we're going to finish with Jess. And I want to finish with Jess because I want to give her the last word because she's on the ballot, and we need folks to get to know her. And this question is, how can we learn from the successes of the LGBTQ rights movement to achieve goals for the disability rights movement? Maria.
I think that we can learn a lot from the LGBTQ rights movement in terms of culture engagement. I will say that there is still no comprehensive civil rights protections for LGBTQIA+ people, and yet in terms of visibility, in terms of a cultural conversation, this movement has advanced farther than the disability rights movement has, and I think that's because so many LGBTQ leaders really invested in engaging and changing culture. And the disability rights movement, we have this comprehensive civil rights protection, but on a regular basis, I am still told that I will not be disabled in heaven. And so I think we need to really focus on engaging culture and changing culture, because with that culture change, our rights will be more firmly rooted in every aspect of society.
Reggie?
I think every catalyst for change comes in a collective understanding of going down a journey together, right? And I think that while the LGBTQ plus community hasn't been perfect in fighting for our rights over the last half century, our biggest gains have always come whenever we've we've decided not to leave anyone behind. So if there's ever been conversations around leaving trans people, for example, out of important discussions and conversations, we've always stopped folks and said, hey, we can't leave our trans siblings behind, and as a result, people then, as a culture and as a society, begin to see all of us instead of just a few of us. And I think for, whether we're talking about issues around mobility or healthcare or education or employment opportunities and so forth, in regards to people with disabilities, we have to start to understand where everyone's opinions are, where everyone's sort of what conversations are happening out there in society, so that we can band together and then fight for the next, fights for progress together. I think that only being together is the way we can achieve, make the most progress.
That's great. Jessica, you get the last word on this question.
Sounds good. We owe a lot to other movements as disabled people. I think about, LGBTQ movements. I think about the civil rights movements and all of the ways that those movements shaped our own, and how in many ways our movement was an extension of those movements as well. And so for me, I think two things I will say is we need to do more to center the most marginalized among us. So often when people talk about disability movements, I see white movements. So we need to do better to make sure that we are centering Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in our movements, that we are centering LGBTQ people, especially trans people, in our movements, that we are centering folks who live in poverty, that we are centering people who use drugs, that we are not having a movement that is only for the most privileged among us. And then I think the other thing that we need to do more of is to work in cross-movement solidarity. I think we have these artificial separations between our movements that do us more harm than good, because at the end of the day, every policy issue is a disability issue, yes, but every policy issue is also an LGBTQ issue, is also an issue that disproportionately impacts people of color, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think we need to do more to work together across those artificial boundaries between our movements. And I think the way that we do that, to return to my first point, is by centering those who are most oppressed, who are most impacted by the topic at hand. So that's what I think, all of our movements need to learn. We need to learn to do, certainly, taking our cue from the civil rights movements and from the LGBTQ movements. I'm excited, to keep learning for my campaign. I'm excited to keep being part of those movements. And, we have a long way to go to build power for marginalized people.
Well, I want to thank you all for joining us, and I want to thank all of our viewers for joining us today. I certainly have a lot more hope after listening to these three brilliant leaders today. Heard a lot about allyship, and we heard a lot about working together. And so, thank you all for joining us today, and hopefully that we'll see you on the next one of these Victory Fund Lives.